Now for today's program. Wendy Rhein is a lifelong nonprofit professional, a farmer, a writer, a shepherd, an entrepreneur, and a mother of two. She is currently the Senior Director of Philanthropy at Repair the World, which mobilizes Jews and their communities to take action to pursue a just world. She also serves as board chair for Nazon, formerly Challah for Hunger, an organization that seeks to end hunger on college campuses. Wendy was selected earlier this year for Lilith Magazine's The New 40, a writing cohort for Jewish feminists. In 2021, Wendy fulfilled a lifelong dream of moving from the city to the country when she purchased a 10-acre farm in rural North Carolina. Chutzpah Hollow, which is now a thriving and growing Jewish farm, is home to sheep, chickens, turkeys, goats, cows, dogs, barn cats, and her family of 3. Wendy and her friend Melissa chronicle her journey of becoming a Jewish farmer in the podcast, So You Want to Be a Farmer. Adrienne Krone is an assistant professor of environmental science and sustainability and religious studies at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on religious food justice movements in North America. Adrienne's current research project is an ethnographic and historical study of the Jewish community farming movement. Noah Phillips is Moment's digital editor. He is also a Hebrew school teacher in Oakland, California. Noah is a former resident of Urban Adamah, a Jewish teaching farm in Berkeley, California, and a board member of Pisces, a small organic teaching farm in the Souvans region of Togo in West Africa. He is a former resident of Flux Factory, an art collective in New York City. Noah has a master's degree in social work and has worked in mental health in New York City. Please welcome Wendy Rhein, Adrienne Krone, and Noah Phillips.
Thank you, Suzanne. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Noah Phillips. I'm zooming in from Oakland, California. I'm the digital editor at Moment. Today, as you know, we're talking about the modern movement of Jewish farming, and specifically Jewish farming in North America. So a little bit of background: we published a big story about the history of this movement and the present day movement earlier this year. Today, we're joined by 2 of my star sources, without whom the story would not have been what it was. Wendy and Adrienne, so glad to be speaking with you both again.
Glad to be here.
So the story came to be because Suzanne, who we just heard from, knows Wendy from way back from DC. She and many other people through the podcast have been really inspired, Wendy, by the way that you have shifted gears and picked up and moved to North Carolina and started a homestead. You were sharing before we started that today you surpassed 100 animals, and you've only been doing this for about a year, a little bit more than a year?
Little over a year. Yeah, a little over a year.
Yeah. So please tell us a little bit about what motivated you to make that step.
Sure. And thank you so much, Noah, for having me, and Suzanne as well for having me. Suzanne has heard elements of this story for years now. I have, for as long as I can remember, wanted to have a homestead, wanted to be a farmer for all sorts of reasons, for food reasons, for ethical reasons, for Jewish reasons, for parenting reasons, for lots of different reasons. And during the pandemic, I really had that opportunity to have a job where I could live and work anywhere I wanted, and Repair the World offered that for me to be able to do that. And I know it had for a lot of other people, the idea that we could work remotely, right, has opened up a whole world of possibilities. So I was able to, in 2021, purchase a 10-acre farm in rural North Carolina. And we moved from the suburbs of Washington, D.C., myself and my 2 teenage sons, uprooted their whole lives and came to a town that is actually smaller than the high school my son attended. In Maryland. So, and since that time, it's been an incredible journey to learn what it means to be close to your food sources and close to a community of people that are interdependent, and also, I think, in many ways more independent in the way in which we interact with the land and our food systems and our animals. And yes, as of today, I have bypassed what I 3 years ago would have thought was complete insanity, and have more than 100 animals on this property.
You also now have 3 cows. Tell us a little bit, for a little bit of color, what's outside your window and what's in your garage?
Oh gosh. Right now, what is outside my window? I can see 3 adult turkeys, one of whom will be joining our Thanksgiving table, not as a guest. And I have, I can see 4 goats. And and a cow that is very pregnant and should be delivering any day now. Also, we have 2 mini cows that are just smaller in stature, but are also on the property. And in my garage, I have 6 guinea keats, which is a small poultry bird, that not one that you eat, but that helps eat red ants and ticks and other unwanted things on the property. That helps keep me from using any kind of pesticides because they help deal with some of the insect population. And then I also picked up 25 2-day-old chicks today from the mail, from the post office, and they will eventually end up in our freezer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then your day job also exists.
Yes. Well, and that's just what I can see. That's not all the animals on our property. I also have 19 sheep on our property as well, and another 30 turkey poults that we're helping to raise for another family. So there's a lot. And then I have a day job where I get to work with an incredible team at Repair the World, which is an organization that promotes Jewish engagement for young adults in healing communities.
Yeah, my partner and I are considering very strong. We keep going back and forth about whether to get a dog. One single animal, but anyway.
It's a gateway. Dogs are a gateway drug. No, be careful.
4 chickens.
Well, then you definitely have already passed through the gateway if you had chickens.
Yeah. So before we get too far down the animal rabbit hole, Adrienne, you are an authority on Jewish farming community organizations in North America. When last we spoke, you were on the road on this like epic sounding road trip for like visiting all these different Jewish farming projects in the country. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned on the trip and your research in general?
Absolutely. And I'll first say that I'm one kind of authority on Jewish farms, but the Jewish farmers, of course, are a different kind of authority and know far more than I do about what farming actually entails. So I have been studying the Jewish community farming movement for about a decade now, and I do ethnographic work, which means I go to farms and I do whatever people there are doing. So I have participated in all aspects of raising produce and animals and creating products, cheeses, pickles, jams, things like that. This summer, I was doing mostly return visits to Jewish community farming organizations that I had previously visited. And this is just to give a sense of where my research boundaries are. So I tend to research Jewish community farms that have been set up as communal institutions. So these are places that are usually founded as nonprofits, funded by grants and federations and some of the usual sources, philanthropy, and are really set up as educational spaces for Jewish communities and as engagement spaces. So these are places where people can go learn about Jewish laws about agriculture, about some of the connections with Jewish holidays and agriculture, by participating, right? By actually going and seeing what it means. We just came through Sukkot, a harvest festival, right? What does it look like on the farm on Sukkot, where people live in the United States and in Canada? So this summer I was mostly returning to some of the Jewish community farming organizations that I was at pre-pandemic and was now visiting finally, after a few years of not being able to visit, was visiting to see what's going on kind of not post-pandemic, but later in the pandemic, perhaps. And then I was also visiting some places that didn't previously exist and started up in the last couple of years because this is a growing movement and it's hard to keep up with all the new projects that are out there.
There are so many, and they are, like you said, growing. Just for a little bit of visuals, as Suzanne mentioned, I was a resident of Urban Adamah. It's in Berkeley. It's sort of in this industrial area. I'm just saying this is kind of a representative thing for people to visualize, you know, kind of an industrial area near the freeway. But it's 2 acres of sort of beautifully landscaped, you know, strawberries, and kale, and chard, and I was just at Simchat Torah there, like on Monday. So they do events, and it's not like a farm in the sense of, you know, having truckloads of carrots to bring to the market. All the food goes to food pantries, as far as I'm aware. So that's kind of the genre of Jewish farm that you're talking about, Adrienne.
Yes, absolutely. And Urban Adamah was one of the ones. So they were previously on a smaller site at a few blocks away, and I had not yet seen their bigger, even more beautiful current site. And so I got to see that this summer.
Beautiful.
You got to check in, because things are happening.
Things are happening. Things are absolutely happening. So a question for both of you. This is a broad question that I warned you about yesterday. What's the deal with Jewish farming? What, you know, you both expressed to me that, you know, when you mention you're connected to Jewish farming, people are like, what is that? Is that a thing I need to care about? Is that a thing that exists? I didn't know that Jews could like get their hands dirty, or like want, like on a sort of broader level, like what is this? You know, people associate Jews with kind of an urban lifestyle. So whether or not that's accurate. So what's Jewish farming? What does it mean to be a Jewish farm?
Adrienne, do you want to go first? And my experience is more limited than yours.
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things that, because I do get this question, people say, oh, Jews farm? Like, what are you talking about? And I think one of the interesting things is that if you look at the Torah, if you look at our foundational stories, it's an agricultural people. And you're reading about essentially subsistence farmers, people who were growing the food that they needed to eat. And when they were harvesting the food, they were grateful and gave thanks to God for having food to eat so they could survive through another season. Again, this week, right? Praying for rain, right? A lot of these kind of foundational Jewish, really ancient Israelite practices were about agriculture. And as Jews, you know, through many centuries and many complicated historical events, moved into diaspora and into urban areas, that started to shift, and what Jewish life looked like started to shift. And people, by force in some cases, by choice in some cases, moved away from agriculture. And so when we talk about Jewish agriculture, it feels far away, and it feels like something unfamiliar, because it has been for many centuries. There was kind of this disruption, but it is not completely outside of what it means to be a Jew. And so a lot of the current movement, and there have been movements throughout history kind of where this picks up in different eras, usually about self-sufficiency and auto-emancipation in the 19th century, where Jews wanted to show that they could do this kind of work. But in the current movement, again, where it's a little bit more about environmentalism and the climate crisis, and some of what we're seeing in the world, it's about reconnecting to this past that exists and these traditions that have been there the whole time. And so maybe Wendy can talk about what that has meant.
I do think it's so much of it is about the returning, right? It is about this, and you know, as Adrienne said, in so many ways, being Jewish and Judaism is an agrarian story. It is an agricultural story. And there is that, you know, the moon cycles, connectivity to the land, paying attention to seasons. And a lot of our holidays and our traditions are rooted in those cycles. And so in many ways, it is, for me at least, it is a returning. And I also think that, you know, I am a Jewish farmer. I'm a Jewish shepherd, and I'm not an institution or an organization. But for me, many pieces of how I show up in the agrarian spaces, in agriculture, in the homesteading community, in our local agricultural economy, is from the perspective of being a Jewish person. It is my practices on this property and on this farm are grounded in Jewish values, are grounded in what I consider to be Jewish ethics, for everything from climate change to treatment and care of any person or animal that comes on this property, the way in which we welcome them, the way in which we care for them, the way in which I focus on the animals on this property having one bad day in their lives, and that is it. And that informs everything we do, from how things are fed, to how we care for the land, to where the water goes, to where animal waste goes, so that it's not impacting the neighbors down the street, right? All of those to me are Jewish values. And so I think that it is a conscious decision when Jewish farmers say they're Jewish farmers, or when an organization says we are operating as a Jewish entity.
It gets at this sort of level of Judaism as like an ethical calling, right? And sort of, and I know that you emphasize tikkun olam, I think sometimes, yes. Wendy, and this, right? And
absolutely, it is. I have an obligation to heal the planet, to heal a community. I am not free to desist from repairing the world, right? So I think that Judaism is a practice. For me, it is something I will never perfect, but it is something that I choose to practice on a daily basis. And it's more than just prayer. It is more than just ritual. It is literally how I show up every day, whether it's in my job or in my farm.
And just to kind of emphasize the point about this being a return, I mean, the first tractate of the Talmud is called Seeds. I mean, and there's huge numbers of agricultural laws about first fruits and bringing them to the temple, and what you do and what you don't do, and leaving the corners of your field untended so that the poor can come and gather them. So it's a very substantial part of our tradition. And you speak, so in terms of repairing the world and being of service to the world, modern conventional agriculture has had hugely damaging consequences for our planet. How do, I guess, Adrienne or Wendy, whoever feels called to answer this question, how do you see that kind of fitting into this moment?
I can just offer some maybe broader perspective. So a lot of the ways that both individual Jewish farmers and the kind of institutional Jewish farms are approaching the agriculture that they're engaging in is usually through sustainable methods. So the way that a lot of our produce is raised in the United States is through monocropping. So people grow one thing. Maybe they rotate their fields, right? Maybe you're rotating corn and soy, or you're just growing all lettuce all the time, right? And so the ways that large scale industrial agriculture works is to do that. You have to add things to the soil. So you have to add fertilizers, and you have to, especially if you have a whole field of one thing, you probably need pesticides, because pests are going to come in that like that one delicious thing that you were growing. And so all of that contributes to soil loss, to water pollution, to major environmental issues that, when a lot of Jews have kind of consciously, like Wendy was talking about, consciously gone into farming because it's something that they feel called to do as a Jewish person, they're usually stepping away from some of those practices and growing things in a smaller scale, and growing things organically or organic certification costs a lot of money. So a lot of farms are operating with organic practices, even if they don't have that certification. And then using methods like smaller scale crop rotation, growing things together, which I saw there was a question in about halakha, and that's an interesting piece actually, is there is a whole Jewish legal framework called kilayim, which prevents the growing of two different kinds of crops in the same field. But growing two things together can often be very beneficial, both for the crops and for the soil. And so that is a negotiation that is often happening in real time on Jewish farms, is how to balance adhering to legal frameworks that in a lot of cases only apply in the land of Israel. So when we're talking about North America, there's a little bit of a legal out, but also are not necessarily the most sustainable practices thousands of years later as we have a little bit more information. And so people are balancing how to think about Jewish law and growing sustainably.
In a way, it's kind of parallel to the eco-kashrut movement, where people will kind of say, well, it's not, you know, it hasn't been keshered by a rabbi, but it's about the ethical principles involved. And as another example of laws that don't really apply technically in North America, but that a lot of people have adopted, Shemitah is a big one.
Yes.
Wendy, do you want to speak about Shemitah?
But the Shemitah, with the idea that every 7 years, basically you leave your land untilled and unplanted, and you allow for whatever volunteers come from that land to be shared with the community, to be unharvested. And it's basically the idea of giving the land a rest and being grateful for all that that land has produced for you. But, you know, as you said, this is one of those things that technically applies in the land of Israel only, but many farms and many Jewish organizations that do agriculture adopted that to different degrees, right? It might be, we're gonna raise a crop and give it all away this year. We're gonna donate it to the community or to food banks. We might be able to say, we're gonna allow the community to come in and harvest whatever is there. So different organizations had to wrestle with that, I think, in very different ways. But even the concept of gleaning, right? This, you know, leaving things that have fallen to the ground. If you have apple trees and the apples that have fallen to the ground, you don't put those into production. You don't take those, but you might invite community members to come and take those as well, and or to pick whatever is there at the end of the season or the beginning of the season. So those are the kinds of questions that I think we ask from an ethical perspective and from a humanist perspective about how we want to show up in our community as Jewish farmers. But you were talking a little bit about the implications of industrial food and industrial food creation and what really has happened over the last 70, 80 years, a very short period of time in humanity, really, since grocery stores and industrial production of food that has changed the way in which most people access food, are separated from the sources of their food, and don't have an understanding of what really went into raising that chicken or raising, you know, the vegetables that we're importing from Guatemala, Mexico, California, depending on where you live, and needing to think about that in a more, in both, for me, a more Jewish perspective, but also just a more ethical and social justice perspective of where is our food coming from? What's the human and environmental impact of that?
And can you speak a little bit, Wendy, about some of the more challenging moments that you've had, or some of the surprising moments that you've had since embarking on this adventure?
Oh, gosh. I had to put down my first farm animal the other day, literally a Sunday. Had to put an animal that had broken its back actually out of its misery. And that's really hard, I think, for any of us to have to think through. You know, you're raising this creature and you want it to have its best possible, safest life. And how do you end a life ethically? And that also required, you know, I had to buy a gun, not that same day. I had done that a few months earlier. And that was a real struggle for me about owning a gun, just for my own way of operating in the world. But having that conversation with myself and then with my teenage sons about what it means to have a gun in the house, and thinking about this, in fact, is something I'm doing out of compassion and out of my responsibility as a steward. That this became a necessary thing for me to put down this young goat the other day. So, you know, those are the kinds of literal life and death things that I've had to wrestle with over the last year and a half that would never have happened prior to this. And there's a huge sense of humility and gratitude in that for me, about being able to be as responsible as I can, but also understanding that there are so many things that I don't know, and so many things that I have to learn on a day-to-day basis that that we've lost as a culture and as a community, but also that are important for me to say, I take this seriously. I'm going to be responsible for this animal's well-being. So that those things, and then everything from, you know, massive rains and losing crops and having to figure out how to reach into a sheep's uterus and vagina and deliver sheep.
How do you do that?
Very gently is how you do that, Noah. And you study and you read and you find every possible YouTube video that you can in the time period that an animal is pregnant, so that you, if you're going to have to do this, that you have, you know, as many tools in your toolbox as you possibly can.
You never know what you're going to learn on a moment seminar.
You never know.
You never know. Speaking of things that one never knows, Adrienne, one thing that I found really fascinating and insightful about your research and about our conversation was your framing of Jewish farms as the new JCC. And I know that's something that a lot of moment readers are interested in, is what meaning younger Jews, and also just any Jew, are, what we're making out of our tradition, because, you know, we pass it from door to door, door to door, and so what's it changing into? This has been a very tumultuous time in Jewish civilization in the last 100 years, to say the least. And so what's next, do you think?
Yeah, I think a number of things are probably next, and Repair the World is certainly part of that, right? So the younger generations, the students that I teach here at Allegheny, the people that I encounter when I visit these farms, are much more engaged and inclined towards social justice in all areas, right? So there's people who are dedicating their lives to working on immigration or reproductive rights or racial issues. And so I think farming and environmentalism are just part of that. But as I mentioned, the contemporary movement, this Jewish community farming movement, basically started in 2004. So this is relatively recent, and that was with the founding of Adamah in Falls Village, Connecticut, by Adam Berman, who then went and founded Urban Adamah as well. And from that first original farm, now there's over 20, because they offer a fellowship program where young 20 and 30 somethings can go and get trained in how to do Jewish farming, and they do a lot of tech study around social justice issues, in addition to some of the practical skills like working with animals. And a lot of those folks have gone out and started projects where they live. And so the movement is growing, and it's engaging Jews who are often otherwise unaffiliated. And so in the world of Jewish demographics, what I have seen is that Jewish community farms and some of these other social justice organizations are attracting people who are being missed by surveyors who are looking for who belongs to synagogues, right? And who attends synagogue services, and even some of the old standards, who fasts on Yom Kippur, who goes to a Passover Seder, Those numbers are remaining relatively high, but this movement is offering something that people can step into that feels closer to the kind of worlds they already inhabit and the interests they already have, and offers them a Jewish lens for how to think about something that in most cases they already are concerned about when we think about environmentalism and climate change and the food system and all of these things.
Adrienne, have you found, I'm also really curious about the intersection of the Jewish farming movement and rural Jewish life.
Yeah.
More and more we're seeing people leave cities and seeing people, and therefore then there are not those traditional structures of a JCC available to many of us who don't live within an urban setting. And I have heard anecdotally from other folks that part of what they find is that the Jewish farming system or organizations is a lot more accessible to them as a Jewish practice because they can't travel 2 hours to services on a Friday night or a JCC if there even is one in the communities in which they live.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say I'm coming from a similar community. So I'm in pretty rural Northwest Pennsylvania. I live in Meadville, which has about 13,000 people, and it's the biggest city in the entire county. So, you know, we have a small synagogue here off campus that is mostly used by our college Hillel. We don't have a JCC. And so I live in one of these communities, and I think you're absolutely right. So some of the larger Jewish institutional organizations doing farming are in big cities, right? Urban Adamah is in Berkeley. But there are a number that are starting to be formed in some of these, and Adamah is in a pretty rural place. So a number of them are not in big cities and are a place where if people are thinking about, okay, I want to go somewhere and do something Jewish, I can either drive to New York or to Boston, or I can drive and spend the weekend at Adamah out in nature and see the beautiful fall colors and enjoy Simchat Torah or go to Sukkah Fest. They are offering an alternative option. And in many cases, a number of the larger institutions are attached to retreat centers. And so then people can go and they can stay and they can have a whole holiday or a whole experience on their own. And even some of the smaller, like Yesod Farm and Kitchen, which I think is pretty close to you, Wendy, they have that ability there where people can come and they can camp and they can stay and they can participate in something Jewish. That looks really different than what might be going on in synagogues in Charlotte or Asheville, but feels like a Judaism that means something to them, right? And connects them in a way to Judaism that maybe a traditional synagogue service might not feel as welcoming to younger Jews for many reasons.
So there's, I just want to kind of note that I see that there's lots of questions pouring in, and we're going to transition to doing audience Q&A in about 5 minutes. So rest assured. And I wanted to, Adrienne, you had told me that there's actually some Jewish farms that are kind of, at least one, Coastal Roots Farm in California, that was developed as a response to demand from otherwise unaffiliated Jews.
Yeah, so the Leishtag Foundation, which is a Jewish family foundation, did a study, either they did, I don't remember this exact detail, either they did the study or the Jewish Community, the Federation did the study, but somebody did a study of Jews in San Diego County and asked if they were affiliated with the JCC, with the synagogues, with the day schools, and then also asked what other kinds of things people were doing. And farmers markets was like the top of the list, right? It was, you know, where do you spend your time? And so many people, so there were, the number for unaffiliated was somewhere around 70% of Jews in San Diego County were unaffiliated. And a lot of them spent time at farmers markets. And so the Leishtag Foundation kind of scoped the country and said, okay, how can we bring these things together? They did a bunch of research. They looked at Adamah, they looked at Urban Adamah. They started bringing people together to talk about Jewish farming. And, you know, just to be upfront, they have given me funding to do some of this research. And they said, you know, this is something that's going to connect people. So they started Coastal Roots Farm, which has since formed its own nonprofit organization and runs now on the property of, but as a separate organization than the Leishtag Foundation. And it's working, right? The people didn't lie on the survey. If they can go to a farm stand at a Jewish farm, they will. If they can go to an event at a Jewish farm, they will. And, you know, they're getting events where hundreds and thousands of people show up at their farm because this was something they were already interested in. And now it's a way they can connect to Judaism as well.
I guess my last question before we go into audience questions is, you mentioned that Yesod is just down the road from you, Wendy, and when the article went up, you discovered that you had a mutual contact, and people kind of talk about Jewish geography, and it seems like there's an agricultural Jewish geography. Is that the case?
Absolutely. So Yesod is, if you consider in the rural world, down the road is an hour. Is about an hour away from me, but that is down the road, right? I mean, it's in, you know, everything is down the road around here. So yes, there is definitely a geography. And one of the things that I have found as a relative newbie in this world is how incredibly welcoming and supportive Jewish agricultural communities are, whether it's sharing resources or ideas, or you want to build something out in your community, you know, who has different plants that might be something that they're growing that you're not, but you're trying to get a seedling for. I mean, there's a ton of support and information sharing, and I have yet to experience any kind of like nonprofit competition, honestly, for resources, for guidance, for any of those kinds of resources. And so I have certainly been incredibly grateful for that welcome and that level of support. And it's also a great place to share ideas and to wrestle with some of these questions, some of these ethical questions around butchering of animals, or do I observe Shemitah in a very traditional scripted way or not? You know, and how are you showing up in the world?
And just before I pass it off to Suzanne, you know, an hour may sound like a lot, but it's really just like one ride on the F train from Brooklyn to Manhattan. You know, it's not like urban environments are so cozy. And this is not a movement that's just limited to liberal Jews or Reform, or like one particular movement either.
Yeah, it's across the spectrum. And I certainly have met folks that are part of the Jewish agricultural movement that represent as you would hope, right, the widest possible tapestry of what it means to be Jewish.
Great. Suzanne?
Great. Thank you so much. People have so many questions. Before I forget, I wanted to let people know that you can follow along with Wendy's incredible adventures through her podcast, So You Want to Be a Farmer, and her Instagram account at Chutzpah Hollow. And I put that in the chat. So you can link to that. Wendy, what was the tipping point for you that really made you decide to leave the suburbs of DC and move to, as you said, a place smaller than your son's high school?
I think COVID had a lot to do with it, but honestly, what really was the tipping point, I think, for me was this was a lifelong dream. This was something that, to quote another podcaster from another world, is I had made my waiting room my classroom. I had, in my waiting to figure out how to do this, had learned and studied. And you know, Adrienne mentioned Adamah, and they have an incredible remote program called Adamah at Home that happens 2 or 3 times a year, I think now, where you can sign up and basically learn about Jewish agriculture and talk about planting and compost and all these things from the comfort of wherever you are, urban, rural, doesn't matter. I had done that twice. I think that I had learned a lot, but I wanted finally to be able to be a farmer and a homesteader while I still physically could. I am 53 years old. I moved here when I was 52, and I wanted to be able to enjoy living out this dream. So finally, just took the opportunity to do it. And it's a huge risk, and I'm grateful and thankful every day that I can do it.
Thank you. But this question is for both of you. So many rural areas are dominated by a homogeneous population. Have you, Wendy or Adrienne, in your research, have you found that being Jewish in a rural area has caused problems, anti-Semitism? Do you promote, Wendy, that you're Jewish? What do you do about that?
In general, Suzanne, I'm not somebody who shies away from conflict. And I don't think I would walk around inviting conflict per se, but yeah, absolutely. We are the only Jewish family in our town that we know of. And I absolutely talk about being a Jewish person and that this is a Jewish farm, and often have to explain what that means. Not just what it means to be a Jewish farmer, but what is a Jew. We've had the conversation of, no, we don't celebrate Christmas, you know, all of those kinds of things. And I don't think I've been met with any anti-Semitism per se, more a question of, so what does that mean? It's been much more of a learning environment than anything else for people in my community, as much as it's been for me to learn how to use a tractor. So there's information sharing, I think, that goes both ways. I have yet to experience anti-Semitism in this particular community. I'm sure others have, though.
I would say something similar personally, that so until recently, I was also the director of Jewish Life here at Allegheny. And so I was very open and, about my Jewishness, and that there were Jewish students on campus, that there were Jewish things happening here. There's some things in town always that you have to deal with in small towns. At Christmas, they actually put a manger in our town square. So, you know, it is a pretty homogenous area, but I have often been met with exactly what Wendy is talking about, polite questioning, right? Rather than any kind of overt anti-Semitism. I think for the Jewish community farms in more rural spaces, there are once in a while, like, you know, something will get egged or something will happen, but I think lots of places get egged once in a while. And so what you don't see, what you do see with some of the especially after, I'm not too far from Pittsburgh, right? What happened in Pittsburgh, what happened in Poway and in Texas, Jewish farms don't usually have that like security enforcements in the same way. Some of the urban ones do, right? Urban Adamah is surrounded by a fence. And so I think you do see a difference there between the urban and the rural spaces. That in rural areas, people mostly just leave you alone.
There is certainly, I think one of the questions in the chat mentioned this as well. Within the homesteading movement, organized structures within the homesteading movement in particular tend to be more Christian driven than not. And so I think that's very different than the agricultural world, which is a different group of folks, has been my experience.
But hopefully it may be, and not to sort of jump in, but like a way to, I mean, you're homesteading for partially Jewish reasons, and people are homesteading for Christian reasons, and it might be a way to build bridges.
I would love us to get there.
Yeah, I saw there was a question about gleaning too, and a lot of the contemporary gleaning movements do come out of Christian communities.
Yes.
Our you know, Torah is their Old Testament. So some of these ideas that we're talking about that were inherent to like ancient Israelite culture also show up in texts that Christians read all the time. So
Mm-hmm. You mentioned egging, so let's take it in a different direction. Wendy, do you get a lot of eggs? What do you do with your eggs? Do they taste different than what you buy in the grocery store?
All fascinating questions. Yes, they taste different. They are glowing orange yolks. And that all depends on what they eat, right? So the yolks change color. The outside of the shell has nothing to do with what you feed them and has everything to do with the breed of chicken, right? So it has brown eggs are not inherently more healthy than white eggs or than purple eggs or blue eggs or whatever. It's more about what's inside the eggshell than outside. So yeah, I do think they taste different. I find a lot more viscosity in egg whites from chickens that are free ranged on grass than those that are raised in a factory setting. I don't know why. That's just an anecdote. I'm sure there's some science that would prove me wrong on that, or maybe not. What I received during the height of the summer, we have 17 chickens. I might get a dozen eggs a day at the height of the summer. Chickens need sunlight to lay eggs, and then as the season begins to dwindle and there are fewer hours of sunlight during the day, I get fewer eggs. So as today, I went out and collected 6 for today's nesting box, and we do everything from preserve them because it is a seasonal food for me, and so we do preserve our eggs. So I can have fresh eggs throughout the winter when I get fewer eggs. And we also give them away and barter them. We barter our eggs as well for other things in the community, like honey or jams or, sometimes even meat. It all depends.
Mm-hmm. An important question. What is the difference between homesteading and farming?
Very good question. Homesteading is generally where you are producing food for just your family. And focusing on your sustainability or self-sustainability, and farming tends to be when you're selling something.
Thank you. And I know somebody asked how many people work on your farm?
Me, my 2 kids, and occasional visitors. That's it.
And how did your sons adjust to hearing they were going to be moving to North Carolina? Were they part of the decision?
Absolutely.
And how are they involved now?
As a single mom, my kids are involved in most decisions that I make. So yes, they were absolutely involved in the conversations around where we were going to live and finding this particular farm. My youngest came with me for the inspections on this property so that he could walk around and meet the current homeowners. And we talked about the farm, and he asked a lot of questions. He is my farmer. In this process, says that he's never going to leave. My older son is now a senior in high school. So we moved here at the beginning of his junior year of high school. And he is my urban dweller, misses public transportation, misses being able to go to the Smithsonian on a weekend, and has adjusted incredibly well. They're resilient people, and they are adaptable people. And I think that is probably one of the best things that I could have instilled in them, is adaptability and resilience. So they are very involved. They have morning chores before school and evening chores when they come home. They both have different aspects of being here that they enjoy, whether it's working on animal husbandry versus the mechanics of our fence lines and how things work. So we've all in this process discovered what we love and what we don't. And have worked out as a team who does what.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people are asking about you and slaughtering your animals. I think there's a few people that are just curious how you do it. And there's a few people who want to know the idea of raising animals and then killing them. And how do you wrap your mind around that?
These are all fantastic questions. When it came to the smaller animals, the chickens or turkeys, for example, or ducks, we did ducks as well this year. We did them ourselves here on the property. Had a couple that live nearby come over and teach us, because I wanted to do this in a safe way, both physically safe for us. It's a lot of sharp knives, but also in a way that was as respectful as possible of the life that we were ending. So we had folks come over and teach us, and we did it ourselves. And I had earlier on in the property, we did raise 2 pigs, and I had someone come in and actually butcher them here. So they never left the property. They were raised here from the time they were 6 weeks old until their butcher date when they were about 8 months old. And they were killed on the property, butchered on the property, packaged for distribution here. I didn't want them to have the stress of being removed or having to enter a vehicle that they had never done that before. It was part of my thought process of how can I do this most ethically. And I also have a personal requirement of being physically present for any life that ends here. It's my responsibility. With the pigs, I wasn't the one who actually pulled the trigger, but I need to be a witness to both the life that is being raised, and that's my responsibility, and for taking responsibility for ending that life. That's part of how I ethically wrap my head around the fact that we are carnivores, my family. That's a choice we've made. And therefore, I need to take responsibility for how that life is ended, and very respectfully thinking about how I cook that animal and how I prepare the food, and that we don't waste things. What we don't eat becomes dog food, or becomes another way that is used here, whether I'm making bone broth or stocks, or providing food for the members of our community for things that we don't eat.
Mm-hmm. Because I know you, I know that you are very deliberate on how you name or don't name your animals, and I think it's fascinating. So, can you share a little bit about that and what some of the names are?
We don't name anything we eat. Animals that get a name here means that they're staying here. They become part of the Chutzpah Hollow community. So that's how also we differentiate. Animals are generally named on a farm in generations tied to an alphabet. So my sheep, for example, are all, the adult sheep have B names because they came from another generation's farm where they had A names. So I have all the Bs. So, and if you have a name on this property, it is generally either Hebrew or Yiddish or came from the Torah. So that's just also part of how we name things. So we have a Bethesda, a Brea, a Bet, a Bess. We've gotten now our first set of lambs from that crew. So they have C names for the ones that we are keeping. Chana and Chesed and Chai all are part of the crew that we are keeping. Yeah.
What's the name of your cows?
The cows, Kishka is the current pregnant one. And then we also have Lila Tov and Lev, who are also part of the cow herd.
Mm-hmm. Adrienne, can you share some Jewish farming associations or guilds or other resources that are available to people who may be farmers themselves and not aware?
Yeah, I will also, just to tie in first, say that some of the larger Jewish community farming organizations do offer kosher slaughter demonstrations, usually at particular holiday events and other things. So if that is something folks are interested in, you might look into visiting one of these places when they are doing that, if you want to see what kosher slaughter actually looks like, which is a very particular process, and having participated in it is not always an easy process. And I think Wendy mentioned, but so there's a kind of national, probably international, I think there's probably Canadian folks in there, network called the Jewish Farmers Network. And so it's not regionally specific, but that's a great group. There's a Facebook group for that where if you join the Facebook group, people throw in questions. This happened on my farm. I don't know what to do. Does anyone want, the farm next to me is for sale. Does anyone want to move here and farm by me? So there's all sorts of community conversation and collective working out of issues through that network. There's a website for that as well, and they have an annual conference that has been remote because of the pandemic, but they're hoping to be back in person in the spring. So check out the Jewish Farmers Network. I saw the specific places were the Pacific Northwest and Vermont. I don't know of larger Jewish institutional farms in those areas, but there are definitely Jewish farmers in those areas.
I believe in Vermont, there's the Living Tree Alliance that does
yes, and yes, which is Jewish and big, and they do all sorts of things there. So and I think they're part of the Jewish Farmers Network. So that's the place to go for everything.
And we'll send a follow-up email later this week, and we'll include some of these associations and links, and anything that the two of you want to send to me, I can include as well. I do want to acknowledge that several people have written in about their own families being part of the Jewish Farming Network. Someone from Ocean and Monmouth counties in New Jersey, raising chickens in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Someone wrote in prior to the program that they moved to Arkansas Ozarks in 1976, and that their families were immigrants from Kiev in 1882 as part of the alum movement. Somebody else said that their grandparents were from Ukraine and met and farmed in Connecticut for 10 to 15 years. So there's definitely that rich history. Wendy, can you share with folks one of your proudest moments and one of your funniest moments of being on the farm?
Gosh, I think one of my proudest moments was literally recently delivering a lamb. I was here by myself. The kids were at school, and I happened to be in the barn checking on something, and there was a lamb in labor. I mean, a sheep in labor, and she had delivered the first, and the twin. She was the sheep was she was exhausted. She had just stopped pushing, and she had kind of collapsed on the ground. And so in that moment, being able to do something, right? That I was so proud that I didn't hesitate, and that I was actually able to just go down, and that she trusted me, and that she didn't run away. And that I was able to bring that lamb out safely and be able to ensure that it was nursing, and that it is still thriving on this property. So I was most proud of both my ability to not hesitate, but the fact that the sheep trusted me, that we had built a rapport, that there wasn't fear, that I was in this incredibly vulnerable moment for this prey animal that is used to running away. So I was really proud of that. Probably one of the funniest moments was when all the goats got out. We had 8 goats at one point, when all of the goats had broken through a fence line, and it was before the front of my property was fenced, and we're in the middle of the road. And I didn't know about it until I heard cars honking, and they were trying to get the goats out of the road, who were just standing there. So having to leave a conference call for work and say, I'll be right back to my team, I have to go catch goats. And that my entire work team was like, oh, of course you do.
Can you talk a little bit about the food that you grow, and then all the different ways that you use it?
Oh gosh, that in itself could fill up in an hour. We do our best to use every part of whatever is grown. So we had a large vegetable garden over the summer, raised a lot of beans and all of our herbs that I then preserved, whether it's hanging them somewhere to dehydrate, or actually putting them in a dehydrator and then saving them over the course of the year. Everything from fruit that we can barter with other people and trade for eggs, for apples, and things like that, and then being able to preserve those things. I actively can as much as I possibly can, so that we have things available in the wintertime. We freeze a lot of our vegetables as well, parboil it and freeze it, so that we can have those things fresh in the winter. The goal is at any given time that 50 to 75% of anything that is on our plates in this first year is coming from this property. I would love to get up to, in the next 2 years, 75, 85% of everything that we consume coming from here. And that's inclusive of making breads and crackers and condiments and all that fun stuff.
And as we wrap up, Adrienne, can you tell, we talked a lot about people who are farmers, but for people who want to have a farming back to the land experience, how do they find out where they can go in communities near them?
Yeah, so there is a website for the Jewish community farming movement that lists some of the bigger organizations. But in a lot of communities, a place to start, a lot of synagogues and JCCs and day schools and camps have a lot of land. And through initiatives of Hazon, which is a national Jewish environmental organization, and some other organizations, a lot of those places now have small gardens. So those experiences are accessible on a smaller scale at a lot more places. A lot of synagogues and JCCs and day schools have kind of identified a person on staff as a kind of greening professional through some of these broader initiatives. And so that's something to check in and see if you're, and if your synagogue or JCC or doesn't have a greening committee or anything like that, you could start one. Because those places do have a lot of land, and that land could be used to grow things. And they're great tie-ins for religious schools, classes. It gives them something to do, something to connect what they're learning. If they're learning about Sukkot, or if they're learning, it gives them something to connect to the material that they're learning in those classes.
Thank you. And real quickly, is there anything either of you want to touch upon about the role of women in farming and the farming movement, the history of the movement? We usually tend to think of it in the past as man's work, and we know that that's not true.
So not true. Women have been actively involved in farming, in commerce related to farming, in food preparation, preservation, hunting, right? Any kind of care and support for land, animals, and production of food for generations. And I think that there are many, many women. I have encountered many women, both of my age and significantly younger, who are coming to this movement as a way of having some agency over their time, over how they interact economically and socially with other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote something for the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia on some of the roles that women have played in this movement, and just to connect back to some of the historical family stories that people were raising when some of these Jewish agricultural communes were founded in the late 19th century. They were founded by families. So it was men and women working together, trying to survive in the rural plains of New Jersey, or these were kind of all over the country. And so to the extent that Jews have been involved in agriculture, it's almost always everybody has to be involved to get it done. So women do have there are a number of women-led Jewish community farming organizations. Women have been instrumental in the kind of growth of Jewish environmentalism, but this is not new, as Wendy was saying. And I just see a question come in. There is such thing as farm camp. A lot of these organizations have them, and there is now an Eden Village on both the East and West Coasts that is a Jewish farm camp.
Mm-hmm. And I know in Baltimore, there's a program as well.
At Pearlstone, absolutely.
Yes, and many more. What's on your nightstands? What books? How many?
I'm surrounded by books. I am listening to an audiobook that's kind of a futurist vision of a world without animals. So it's kind of a dark take on where we could go with climate change. So that might not be the most uplifting thing. I tend to read a lot of academic books, but I did recently read, I'll grab it, Kosher Soul. We'll just do a little pitch. Michael Twitty's great. He writes about agricultural history. This book's a little bit more about being Black and being Jewish and some of the foodways that exist at that intersection. So.
And how about you, Wendy?
I'm looking at the list. There's books that are in front of me in this moment. I am reading a book right now called What If Women Rose Rooted? I think, and it's about the idea of if women were more rooted to possibility in the land and a sense of belonging. So I'm reading that. I am looking at a book called Mother Grains right now about small scale growing of traditional grains like quinoa and amaranth and others, because that's something that I really would like to do on our property, is to start growing some grain, both for the animals, but for our own consumption. And I have a book right in front of me around herding and shepherding herds, because I want to grow our sheep herd more in the next year.
And as we really do have to wrap up, what's next? What's next for you, Wendy?
Oh gosh. Next is a small commercial kitchen on our property to be able to do food production that could go to market, including sheep's cheese, and also making it available to people in the community. A lot of the women in this community who would like to be able to take things to market and need a commercial kitchen to do that, and a small gathering place. I mean, similar to what we were talking about events and bringing people in. Get a lot of requests for that in the Southeast in particular, as a way of bringing people in for things like Sukkot, but also canning demonstrations. And how do you take care of sheep and animal husbandry and other things on a smaller scale, because a lot of those things are built for commercial production and for large scale farmers, and not a lot for homesteaders. So we're hoping to do some of that this year as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank Noah and Adrienne and Wendy for this fabulous, fabulous conversation. As I mentioned, I will send an email later this week that will include a link to the recording, along with all the fabulous resources that both Adrienne and Wendy discussed. A reminder, Wendy's podcast is So You Want to Be a Farmer. Instagram is at Chutzpah Hollow. I encourage people to go to momentmag.com, where you can read the article that Noah wrote about the history of farming in America. And also please register for next week's Zoominar about secrets and shame. Again, thank you for everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.